Welcome back, everybody. Let's get into some part 7 of Hegelians of the Storm. Thank you all for joining, and I hope that you very much enjoy Left Your Chase Out. Section C, double A, Reason. Section 5, Certainty and Truth of Reason. In the thought it has grasped that the singular consciousness is in itself absolute essence, consciousness returns into itself. For the unhappy consciousness, the being in itself is the beyond of itself, but its movement has accomplished this in it. It has posited singularity in its complete development, or it has posited the singularity that is actual consciousness as the negative of itself, namely as the objective extreme, or it has wrested its being for itself away from itself and has turned it into being, essentially a negation of the negation. In this movement, its unity with this universal has also come to be for consciousness, a unity which, for us, no longer falls outside it, since the sublated singular is the universal, and which, since consciousness maintains itself in this negativity, is in consciousness as such its essence. Its truth is that which appears in the syllogism, whose extremes were held absolutely asunder when they entered the scene, as middle term which proclaims to the unchangeable consciousness that the singular has renounced itself, and to the singular that the unchangeable is for it no longer an extreme, but is reconciled with it. This middle term is the unity immediately aware of and relating both and is the consciousness of their unity, which it proclaims to consciousness and thereby to itself. It is the certainty of being all truth. Now that self consciousness is reason, its hitherto negative relationship to otherness turns round into a positive relationship. So far, it has been concerned only with its independence and freedom, with a view to saving and maintaining itself for itself at the expense of the world or of its own actuality, both of which appeared too as the negative of its essence. But as reason, assured of itself, it has made its peace with them and can endure them, for it is certain of itself as actuality, or certain that actuality is none other than itself. Its thinking is immediately actuality, and thus it adopts towards actuality the attitude of idealism. Conceiving itself in this way, it is for as if the world had now arisen for it the first time. Previously, it does not understand the world. It desires it and works on it, withdraws from it into itself, and demolishes it for itself, and demolishes its own self as consciousness, both as consciousness of the world, and as the essence, and as consciousness of the nullity of the world. It is only after the grave of its truth has been lost, after the demolition of its actuality has itself been demolished, and after the singularity of consciousness is in itself absolute essence for it, it is then that it discovers the world as its new actual world, which in its permanence holds an interest for it which previously lay only in its disappearance, for the subsistence of the world becomes for consciousness its own truth and presence. It is certain of experiencing only itself therein. Reason is the certainty of consciousness that it is all reality. This is how idealism expresses its concept. Just as the consciousness that comes on the scene as reason immediately has that certainty in itself, so too idealism expresses that certainty immediately. I am I. And again, that sentence is only achieved after the demolishing of the demolishing. So you can't be self aware to the point of being able to know that I am I is the truth without having undergone the demolishment of all other options and the demolishment of your ability to demolish. Meaning that once you have rendered everything gone, all that remains is I am I, in the sense that I, which is an object for me, is not merely an empty object in general, as in self consciousness in general, nor is it merely an object that withdraws from the others, leaving them in force alongside it. as in the case of the free self-consciousness. Instead, it is an object with the consciousness of the non-being of any other object. It is the sole object, all reality and all presence. But self-consciousness is all reality not merely for itself, but also in itself. Only through becoming this reality, or rather through demonstrating itself to be such. It demonstrates itself thus on the path on which first, in the dialectical movement of meaning, perceiving, and understanding, otherness vanishes as in itself, and that again, meaning, so there is no delineation between otherness and one's own identity. And then, in the movement through the independence of consciousness in lordship and bondage, through the thought of freedom, the skeptical liberation, and the combat of absolute liberation of the consciousness divided within itself, otherness, insofar as it is only for consciousness, vanishes for consciousness itself. Two sides entered the scene, one after the other, one in which the essence or the true had for consciousness the determinacy of being, the other in which had the determinacy of being only for consciousness. But the two reduced themselves to one truth, that what is, or the in itself, is insofar as it is only for consciousness, and what is for consciousness is also in itself. The consciousness which is the truth has this path behind it and forgotten it. When it comes on the scene immediately as reason, or this reason which comes immediately on the scene enters the scene only as a certainty of that truth, thus reason merely affirms that it is all reality, but does not itself comprehend this, for that forgotten path is the comprehension of this immediately expressed assertion. And equally, to anyone who has not traversed that path, this assertion is incomprehensible when he hears it in its pure form. For in a concrete shape, he does indeed make the assertion himself. Idealism, which does not present that path but begins with this assertion, is therefore also pure affirmation, which does not comprehend its own self, nor can it make itself comprehensible to others. It expresses an immediate certainty, which is confronted by other immediate certainties, which have, however, gotten lost on that path. With equal right, therefore, the affirmations of these other certainties too take their place alongside the affirmation of that certainty. Reason appeals to the self-consciousness of each and every consciousness. I am I. My object and essence is I, and no consciousness will deny reason this truth. But in basing the truth on this appeal, reason sanctions the truth of the other certainty, namely, there is for me another, an other that than I is object and essence for me, or, in that I am object and essence to myself, I am so only by drawing back from the other in general, and taking my place as an actuality alongside it. Only when reason comes on the scene as a reflection from this opposite certainty does its assertion about itself enter the scene, not merely as certainty and affirmation, but as truth, and not alongside other truths, but as the sole truth. Its immediate entry onto the scene is the abstraction of its sheer presence, whose essence and being in itself is absolute concept, i.e., the movements of having come about. Consciousness will determine its relationship to otherness, or its object, in diverse ways, according to the precise stage it occupies of the world spirit becoming conscious of itself. How it immediately finds and determines itself is the object at any time, or how it is for itself depends on what has already become, or what it already is in itself. Reason is the certainty of being all. This in itself, or this reality is, however, still a universal, pure and simple, the pure abstraction of reality. It is the first positivity, which self-consciousness is in its own self, for itself, and I is therefore only the pure essentiality of being, or is the simple category. The category, which formerly had the significance of being the essentiality of beings, indeterminately of beings in general, or of beings facing consciousness, is now essentiality, or simple unity of beings only as actuality that thinks, or the category is this, that self-consciousness and being are the same essence, the same not in comparison, but in and for themselves. It is only the one-sided, bad idealism that lets this unity again plant itself on one side as consciousness and confronting it and in itself. But now this category or simple unity of self-consciousness and being has difference in it, for its essence is just this, in otherness or in absolute difference, to be immediately equal to itself. The difference therefore is, is perfectly transparent, and as a difference that is at the same time no difference. It appears as a plurality of categories. Since idealism proclaims the simple unity of self-consciousness to be all reality, and immediately makes it the essence without having comprehended it, is absolutely negative essence. Only this has negation, determinacy, or difference within itself. This second point, that in the category there are differences or species, is even more incomprehensible than the first. This affirmation in general, as well as the affirmation of a determinate number of species of categories, is a new affirmation, which, however, itself implies that we no longer have to accept it as affirmation. For since the difference originates in the pure I, in the pure understanding itself, it is thereby posited that the immediacy, the affirming, and the finding are here abandoned and comprehension begins. But to take the plurality of categories again in some way or as other, as a find, ergo, from judgments and accepting them like that, should in fact be regarded as an outrage on science. Where else should the understanding be able to show a necessity, if it is unable to do so in its own self, which is a pure necessity? Now, because the pure essentiality of things, like their difference, belongs thus to reason, we can, strictly speaking, no longer talk of things at all, i.e., of something which would be for consciousness merely the negative of itself. For to say that the many categories or species of the pure category means that this latter is still in their genus or essence, not opposed to them. I can't wait to drop the whole Darwinism thing that we got going on. I don't know if a biological set of assumptions is the best way to communicate this, but again, this was like 1850, so alright. In fact, they contradict the pure category by this plurality, and the pure unity must sublate them in itself, thereby constituting itself as a negative unity of the differences. But as negative unity, it excludes from itself the differences as such, as well as that first immediate pure unity as such, and is singularity, a new category. Taking a quick yawn break. New category which is consciousness as excluding, i.e., consciousness for which there is another. Singularity is the transition of the category from its concept to an external reality, the pure schema which is both consciousness and, since it is singularity and exclusive unit, the pointing to another. But this other of this category is merely the other first categories, vis-a-vis pure essentiality and pure difference. And in this category, i.e., just in the positiveness of the other, or in this other itself, consciousness is equally itself. Each of these diverse moments refers to another moment, but at the same time in them we do not get to any otherness. The pure category refers to the species, which pass over into the negative category or singularity. This latter, however, reflects back to them. It is itself pure consciousness, which in each species remains to itself this clear unity with itself, but a unity which equally is referred to another, which, when it is, has vanished, and when it has vanished, also regenerates itself. Here we see pure consciousness posited in a twofold manner. Once as the restless movement to and fro that runs through all its moments, having in them before its eyes an otherness that sublates itself in the act of grasping it, and again rather as the tranquil unity certain of its own truth. For this unity that movement is the other, while this movement that tranquil unity is the other, and consciousness and object alternate in these reciprocal determinations. Thus at one time consciousness is to itself a search moving hither and thither, hither and thither, and its object is the pure in itself and essence, and at another time it is to itself the simple category, and the object is the movement of the differences. But consciousness as essence is this whole course itself, of passing out of itself as simple category into singularity and the object, and of intuiting this course in the object, sublating it as a distinct object, appropriating it, and proclaiming itself this certainty of being all reality, of being both itself and its object. Its first proclamation is only this abstract, empty word that is everything in its own. For the certainty of being all reality is at first only the pure category. Another yawn break. This reason, which first recognizes itself in the object, finds expression in the empty idealism which grasps reason only as it is initially, and fancies that by indicating this pure mine of consciousness in all being. This reason, which first recognizes itself in the object and finds expression in the empty idealism, which grasps reason only as it is initially, and fancies that by indicating this pure mine of consciousness in all being, and by declaring things to be sensations or representations, it has indicated this pure mine as completed reality. It therefore must at the same time be absolute empiricism, since for the filling of the empty mine, i.e., for the difference and all development and shaping of the difference, its reason requires that an alien impulse in which variety of sensation or representation is first to be found. This idealism therefore becomes the same kind of self-contradictory equivocation as skepticism, except that while skepticism expresses itself negatively, this idealism expresses itself positively, but it fails as much as skepticism to bring together its contradictory thoughts, the thought of pure consciousness as all reality, and likewise the thought of the alien impulse, or of sensation and representation as an equal reality. Instead, it rushes to and fro from one to the other, and has ended up by falling into bad infinity, namely sensory infinity. Since reason is all reality in the sense of the abstract mind, and the other is to it an indifferent alien, what is here posited is precisely the same knowing of another by reason, which we met as the which we met with as meaning, perceiving, and as the understanding that apprehends what is meant and what is perceived. Such a knowing is at the same time asserted by the concept of this idealism itself not to be a true knowing, for only the unity of apperception. Alright, we're going to look that one up, because I don't know what that means. Conscious perception with a full awareness. Apperception. Okay, that's a new word. For only the unity of apperception is the truth of knowing, the pure reason of this idealism in order to reach this other which is essential to it, i.e., which is thus the in itself, but which it does not have within it, is therefore thrown back by its own self into that knowing which is not a knowing of the true. In this way, it condemns itself of its own knowledge and volition to an untrue knowing, and cannot get away from meaning and perceiving, which for it to have no truth. It is involved in immediate contradiction, affirming as the essence a duet of utter opposites, the unity of appreciation, the unity of apperception, and equally the thing, which, whether it is called alien impulse or the empirical essence or sensibility or the thing in itself, remains in its concept the same alien adjunct to that unity. This idealism is involved in this contradiction because it affirms the abstract concept of reason as the true. Consequently, reality immediately arises for it equally as the sort of reality that is not the reality of reason, while at the same time reason is supposed to be all reality. Reason remains a restless searching, which in its very search declares the satisfaction of finding to be utterly impossible. Actual reason, however, is not so inconsistent. On the contrary, at first only the certainty of being all reality, it is conscious of this concept, as certainty, as I, of not yet being reality in truth. It is impelled to raise its certainty to truth, and to fill up the empty mine. Section A. Observing reason. In fact, we now see this consciousness, for which being has the significance of its own, revert to meaning and perceiving, through, though not to certainty of a mere other, but with the certainty of being this other itself. Previously, its perception and experience of various sides of the thing just happened to consciousness, while here consciousness arranges the observations and the experience itself. Meaning and perceiving, which previously were sublated for us, are now sublated by and for consciousness itself. Reason sets out to know the truth, and to find as concept that which for meaning and perceiving is a thing, i.e., to have in thinghood the consciousness only of itself. Reason now has, therefore, a universal interest in the world, because it is the certainty of having presence in the world, or that the presence is rational. It seeks its other, knowing that therein it possesses nothing other than itself. It seeks only its own infinitude. At first, only glimpsing itself in actuality, or knowing actuality only as its own in general, with a sense that this is with a sense of this, it advances to take universal possession of its assured property, and plants the sign of its sovereignty on every height and in every depth. But this superficial mine is not the ultimate interest. The joy of this universal seizure of possession still finds in its property the alien other, which abstract reason does not have within itself. Reason glimpses itself as a deeper essence than the pure I is, and must demand that difference, manifold being, become the I's very own. That is, the I intuit itself as actuality and find itself present as shape and thing. But if reason excavates all the entrails of things and opens every vein in them so that it may gush forth to meet itself, it will not attain this joy. It must have completed itself within itself before it can experience the completion of itself. I can't agree more. I can't agree more. We're going to go maybe 2 more paragraphs. Consciousness observes, i.e., reason wants to find and to have itself as an object that is, as an actual sensorially present mode. The consciousness of this observing indeed opines and says that it wants to undergo experience, not of itself, but on the contrary of the essence of things as things. That this consciousness opines and says this is implied in the fact that it is reason, but reason as such is not as yet object for this consciousness. If it knew that reason is equally the essence of things and of consciousness itself, and that only in consciousness can reason be present in its own proper shape, it would descend into its own depths and seek reason there rather than in things. If it had found it within, reason would be directed from there outside to actuality again, in order to intuit therein its sensory expression, but it wants to take it essentially as concept. Reason, as it immediately arises as consciousness's certainty of being all reality, takes its reality in the same sense of the immediacy of being, and similarly, it takes it to the unity of the I, with the objective essence in the sense of an immediate unity, a unity in which reason has not yet separated and reunited again the moments of being and the I, or a unity which reason has not yet cognized. Reason, therefore, as observing consciousness, approaches things in the opinion that it takes them in truth as sensory things opposed to the I, but its actual doing contradicts this opinion, for it cognizes things, it transforms their sensuality into concepts, i.e., into just a being which is at the same time I, consequently transforms thinking into a thinking that is, or being into a thought being, and it asserts, in fact, that it is only as concept that things have truth. For observing consciousness, all that emerges from this is what the things are, but for us, what consciousness itself is. But the result of its movement will be that consciousness will become for itself what it is in itself. We have yet to consider the doing of observing we have yet to consider the doing of observing reason in the moments of its movement, and how it apprehends nature and spirit, and finally the relation of both as sensory being and how it seeks itself as actuality that it is. Observation of nature. When thoughtless consciousness affirms observation and experience as the source of truth, its words may well sound as if only tasting, smelling, feeling, hearing, and seeing were involved. In the zeal with which it recommends tasting, smelling, etc., it forgets to say that in fact it has also just as essentially already determined the object of its sensation. When thoughtless consciousness affirms observation and experience as the source of truth, its words may well sound as if only tasting, smelling, feeling, hearing, and seeing were involved, and in the zeal with which it recommends tasting, smelling, etc., it forgets to say that in fact it has also just as essentially already determined the object of its sensation, and this determination is worth at least as much to consciousness as that sensation. It will also readily admit that in general its concern here is not solely with perceiving, and will not let, ergo, the perception that this penknife lies alongside this snuff box pass for an observation. That's a callback to earlier in the book. What is perceived should at least have significance of a universal, not a sensory this. This universal is thus at first only what remains equal to itself. Its movement is only the uniform recurrence of the same doing. Consciousness, which to that extent finds in the object only universality or the abstract mine, must take upon itself the movement proper to the object, and since it is not yet the understanding of the object, must at least be the remembrance of it, which expresses in a universal way what in actuality is present only in a singular way. This superficial elevation out of the singularity, and the equally superficial form of the universality into which the sensory is merely taken up without having become in its own self a universal. The describing of things does not yet have the movement in the object itself. The movement is really only in the describing. The object, as soon as it is described, has therefore lost its interest. If the one has been described, then another must be dealt with, and continually sought, in order that the describing does not give out. If it is no longer so easy to find new whole things, then we must go back to those already found, divide them further, analyze them, and bring to light fresh sides of thinghood in them. This restless, insatiable instinct can never run out of material. To discover a distinctive new genus, or even a new planet which, although it is an individual, possesses the nature of a universal, can be the lot of only a lucky few. But the limit of what, like the elephant, the oak, gold, is distinctive of what is genus and species, passes through many stages into the infinite particularization of the chaos of animals and plants, of mountain types, of the metals, earths, etc., that only force and skill can bring into view. In this realm of the indeterminacy of the universal, where particularization, that's a tough word, approximates again to singularization, and again here and there descends to it entirely, an inexhaustible fund is opened up for observation and description. But here, where an immense field opens up for that instinct, at the limit of the universal, it can have found not an immeasurable wealth, but instead merely the boundary of nature and of its own doing. It can no longer know whether what seems to be in itself is not a contingency, what bears in itself the stamp of a confused or immature structure, feeble and barely developing out of rudimentary indeterminacy, can lay no claim even to be only described. If this searching and describing seems to be concerned only with things, we see in fact that it does not continue indefinitely in sensory perceivings. On the contrary, that by which things are cognized is more important to it than the remaining complex of sensory properties, which, of course, the thing itself cannot dispense with, but which consciousness does without. Through this distinction between the essential and the unessential, the concept rises out of sensory dispersion, and cognition thereby declares that it is just as essentially concerned with its own self as with things. With this double essentiality, cognition lapses into vacillation as to whether what is essential and necessary for cognition is so also in respect of things. On the one hand, the differentiae are supposed to serve only cognition, enabling it to distinguish things from one another. But on the other hand, it is not the unessential side of things that is supposed to be cognized, but that side whereby the things themselves break loose from the universal continuity of being in general, separate themselves from the other, and are for themselves. Differentiae are supposed not merely to have an essential relation to cognition, but also the essential determinancies of things, and the artificial system is supposed to conform to the system of nature itself and to express only this. This is necessary from the concept of reason, and the instinct of reason. For in this observing, reason behaves only as instinct. It has also in its systems achieved this unity where, namely, its objects are themselves so constituted that they have in them an essentiality or a being for itself, and are not merely accident of this instant or this here. The distinguishing marks of animals, ergo, are taken from their claws and teeth, for in fact it is not only cognition that thereby distinguishes one animal from another, but the animal also separates itself thereby. By meaning of these weapons, it maintains itself for itself, and detached from the universal. The plant, by contrast, does not attain to being for itself, but it merely touches the limits of individuality. Actually, I just want to put a pause in Hegel real quick. Since Hegel's time alive and writing and all that stuff, we have learned so much more about plants, that they are conscious, that they are able to see, they can smell, they can interact with the world around them in ways that we are struggling to fathom. They share resources freely without any sort of requirement of exchange via the mycelium network. They are very well connected, and honestly, in my opinion, an intelligence beyond our capacity or willingness to understand at this point in our stage as species. Getting back to it, it is at this limit, therefore, when the plant displays the semblance of division into sexes, that the plant has been catalogued and differentiated. What, however, stands on a lower level cannot itself any longer distinguish itself from another, but gets lost when it enters into opposition. Being at rest and being in relationship come into conflict with each other. The thing in the latter is something other than it is according to the former. Whereas the individual consists in maintaining itself in relationship to something else. What, however, is unable to do this, and chemically becomes something other than it is empirically, confuses cognition and embroils it in the same conflict as to whether it ought to keep one side or the other, since the thing itself is nothing stable, and in it the two sides fall apart. In such systems of universal stability, the stability therefore has the significance of being the stability both of cognition and of the things themselves. But this expansion of the stable determinancies, each of which calmly describes the course of, pause for dramatics, course of its progression, and gets room to go on its own way, quite as much passes over the essentiality into its contrary, into the confusion of these determinancies for the differentia, and the universal determinancy is the unity of opposites, of the determinate and the universal in itself. It must therefore split up into this opposition. If now, on one side, the determinancy gains the ascendancy over the universal in which it has its essence, then, on the other side again, the universal in turn establishes its own domination over the determinancy, pushes the determinancy to its limit, and there mixes up its distinctions and essentialities. Observation, which kept them properly apart and believed that in them it had something firm, sees principles encroaching on one another, transitions and confusions forming, and what it at first took to be just separate, it sees in this combined, and what it reckoned to be together, it sees separated, and so this adherence to tranquil, stable being inevitably sees itself tormented just in its most universal determinations. Ergo, what are the essential differentiae of the animal, the plant? by instances which rob it of every determination, render mute the universality to which it had risen, and reduce it to an observation and description devoid of thought. Brutal. This observing which confines itself to the simple or curbs the sensory dispersion by the universal, thus finds in its object the confusion of its principle. Because the determinate must by its nature lose itself in its contrary, reason must therefore advance from the inert determinacy which had the semblance of permanence, to observing determinacy as it is in truth, a vis-a-vis, as relating itself to its contrary. What are called essential differentiae are passive determinacies which when expressed and apprehended as simple, do not present what constitutes their nature, which is to be vanishing moments of the movement which withdraws back into itself, since the reason instinct now reaches the point of looking for the determinacy in accordance with its nature, which is essentially to be not for itself, but to pass over into the opposite. It searches for the law and for the concept of the law. Indeed, it searches for them equally as actuality that is, but this actuality will in fact vanish for it, and the sides of the law become pure moments or abstractions, so that the law comes to light in the nature of the concept, which has eliminated in itself the indifferent subsistence of sensory actuality. To the observing consciousness, the truth of the law is in experience, in the same way that sensory being is for consciousness, not in and for itself. But if the law does not have its truth in the concept, then it is a contingency, not a necessity, or not in fact a law. But the fact of the law is essentially as concept, not only does... But the fact that the law is essentially as concept not only does not conflict with its presence for observation, but is rather the very reason why it has the necessary being there, and is for observation. The universal, in the sense of the universality of reason, is also universal in the sense involved in the concept, a vis-a-vis, that the universal is for consciousness, and that it presents itself as what is present and actual, or that the concept presents itself in the mode of thinghood and sensory being, but without thereby losing its nature and lapsing into inert subsistence or indifferent succession. What is universally valid is also universally effective. What ought to be, in fact, also is, and what only ought to be without being so has no truth. The instinct of reason, for its part, rightly holds firmly to this, and refuses to be led astray by figments of thought which only ought to be, as oughts, are supposed to have truth, although they are nowhere met with in experience, refuses to be led astray by hypotheses any more than by all the other invisibilities of a perennial ought. For reason is just this certainty of having reality, and what is not for consciousness as a self-essence, i.e., what does not appear, is for consciousness nothing at all. That the truth of law is essentially reality, no doubt again becomes, for this consciousness which sticks to observation, an opposition to the concept and to the universal in itself, or a thing such as its law is to it not an essence of reason. It opines that it obtains in it something alien, but it refutes its own opinion by its deed, in which it does not itself take its universality in the sense that all singular sensory things would have to have shown to it in the appearance of the law in order to be able to go and assert the truth of the law. That stones fall when raised above the earth and let go. For this it does not at all require this experiment to be made with every stone. It does not perhaps say that it must have been conducted with at least a great number. Then from this we can by analogy draw an inference about the rest of the great possibility, or with perfect right. But analogy not only does not give a perfect right, but on account of its nature refutes itself so often that the inference to be drawn from analogy itself is rather that analogy does not permit any interference to be made. The probability which the result of analogy would come down to loses in the face of truth. Every distinction of lesser and greater probability, let it be as great as it likes, it is nothing as against truth. But the instinct of reason does in fact accept such laws as truth. You know what, as I'm reading, I'm just kind of thinking, This paragraph right here, that stones fall when raised above the earth and let go. For this does not at all require this experiment to be made with every stone. You know, I hope we can dig into this a little bit more, but I think that that is a very applicable sentence that we need to keep in mind, because again, they're eating babies. The billionaire class is eating babies. Does that mean that every person, once they become a billionaire, will eat a baby? No, probably not. But under the current system that we have in existence, it looks like there's a great probability, you know, because they are capable of getting away with crime. So if we can apply this idea, if only there was some sort of dialectical materialist analysis of the world written by Karl Marx and Engels shortly after this book was written. This one sticks with me. Does not require this experiment to be made with every stone. We know gravity. We know what happens when you give people unlimited access to unlimited resources and absolutely zero consequences. What winds up happening is they eat babies. They eat babies for fun, not even for the because cannibalism is something to be enjoyed. It is because they enjoy breaking the ultimate taboo of eating the young. And again, a lot of these people are men. A lot of these people delight in this ability to deny life to something. They are the antithesis of life, and that they can get away with being the destructor fantasy that they have always yearned for and have enabled their lifestyle by just destroying and exploiting and taking from other people. My God. My God. There must be a law not determined by laws, but by truth of society. And I think that this is what Hegel is talking about right now, where the law has to be determined by a truth, which is we won't eat babies, because we understand not only that that is wrong, or that we have made that act a taboo, but because we understand at a fundamental level that that is unwriting of life in a way that is a performance and opposition to living on this planet, to being alive. That is the ultimate middle finger to life itself, as to the species of humans. You know, that is, in my opinion, that is a declaration of war against humans, is to eat the babies. Man, there's a whole lot of, like, my brain jumps in a whole lot of different directions, so I just want to clarify that if you are a billionaire and you eat babies for the fun of it, or because you enjoy cannibalism, or whatever your personal reason is, you have declared war against humans, and you don't see yourself as a human anymore. You see yourself as something above this. This explains why there are billionaires running out there the way that they are right now, thinking that they can just do whatever they want. Because they have been able to get away with whatever we want. Because our laws are not based on truth. Our laws are based on protecting the billionaire class to enable their fantasies to do whatever they want. And now we have excellent written, documented proof as to exactly what they are doing with that freedom. Because again, our laws are not written by truth. They need to be as true as gravity. They cannot be subjective in the way that our current system is designed around them being, to enable these loopholes, to enable people like Jeffrey Epstein and Donald Trump and all the other people who have profited and eaten and killed and done worse. I mean, we've watched for like 3 years now the destruction of Palestine. And that same level of destruction has been the reality of Black Americans here in the U.S. and Native Americans before them for literally like 200 300 years and some change. Oh no, Columbus, 1400, 600 years. And then, even before then, I'm sure that there was some shenanigans going about, um, with disease spread from even earlier, when Norse people came through. It's because we didn't structure society. We didn't have rules around what needs to be, not what needs to be, what is true to us as people. There in California, on the west coast of the U.S., there was the Tongva people, and I'm not 100% sure as to their history, and I definitely want to read more. But from what I did read in Cedric Robinson's book on Black Marxism, at least my takeaway was this: is that it was the Tongva had pre-devastation of colonialism and genocide, a society that was post-communist in its thinking, in its ideology. It was a society based around truth, about the value of human life and about the relationship that human life has to the land itself. And as I'm reading Hegel, that is all I can think about, because Hegel talks about the importance of this truth. Nothing can stand against this truth, that we are in relationship with the land. That cannot be denied, even by this genocidal billionaire class who has existed throughout Western European history. They have been running rampant. Thank you, white people. But also that desire exists inside of us, and it is and while it is true, while it does exist, it must be true that it can't come out, because what we can witness right now, if you go on to the Department of Justice right now and you search up EFTA, will pull up the Epstein Files Transparency Act, and you can read any of those files, and in it are the most horrific things that you have ever read. And that is the daily experience for people, for humans, for our brothers and sisters, and all of our other siblings that exist on this planet. They are tortured by the billionaire class. They are eaten by the billionaire class. Emotionally, philosophically, ideology, physically, spiritually, and emotionally, they are consumed by a group of people who have gone past humanity, because they understand the truth, that it is wrong to do these things, and they defy it because they know that we can't do anything about it under the current laws and structures and systems that we have. And we know that they feel empowered like that because we structured and they built those laws for them. This is why we have to read. This is why we have to understand. This is why we have to learn. So that way, one day, we can say, no, I reject this system. I cast it off because I hold love, because I hold kindness, because I hold compassion in my heart. Because I know it is wrong to eat babies. And I'm sorry that I keep emphasizing that, but we can't not emphasize, we can't just not talk about it. We're paying taxes into a system where they eat babies. Okay, but the instinct of reason does in fact accept such laws as truth, and it is only in relation to their necessity, which it does not recognize, that it resorts to this distinction, and reduces the truth of the thing itself to probability, in order to indicate the imperfect way in which the truth is present for the consciousness which has not yet attained to insight into the pure concept, for universality is present only as simple immediate universality. But at the same time, on account of this universality, the law has truths for consciousness, that the stone falls is true for consciousness because for it the stone is heavy. That is, because in heaviness the stone has in and for itself the essential relation to the earth, which expresses itself as fall. Consciousness thus has in experience the being of the law, but it likewise has the law as concept, and it is only because of both circumstances together that the law is true for consciousness. It is valid as law because it presents itself in appearance, and is also in its own self-concept. Because the law is at the same time in itself concept, the reason instinct of this consciousness itself proceeds, necessarily, but without knowing that this is its aim, to purify the law and its moments into the concept. It sets up experiments concerning the law. On its first appearance, the law presents itself impurely, enveloped in singular sensory being, the concept constituting its nature immersed in empirical material. Its experiments in the reason instinct sets out to find what happens in such and such circumstances. By this, the law seems only to be all the more plunged in sensory being, but really this sensory being gets lost in the process. The inner significance of this investigation is to find pure conditions of the law, and this means nothing else if the consciousness expressing itself in this way should opine that it means something different by it, than to raise the law entirely into the shape of the concept, and to eliminate all subjugation of its moments to determinate being. For example, negative electricity, which at first announces itself, say, as resin electricity, and positive electricity as glass electricity. Just to clarify, I think that what it means is like electricity that can be conducted versus electricity moving through materials that are not conductive. So resin will block, whereas glass will keep it going. Or maybe it's vice versa. I don't know anything about electricity. Shout out to all electricians out there. Lose altogether this significance and become purely positive and negative electricity, neither of which is any longer attached to a particular kind of thing, and we can no longer say that there are bodies which are positively electrical and others which are negatively electrical. In the same way, the relationship of acid and base and their reciprocal movement constitute a law in which these opposites appear as bodies. But these isolated things have no actuality. The power which forces them apart cannot prevent them from at once entering into a process, for they are only this relation. They cannot, like a tooth or claw, remain for themselves and as such be pointed out. That this is their essence, to pass over immediately into a neutral product, makes their being into a being which is itself sublated or into a universal being, and acid and base have truth only as universals. Therefore, just as glass and resin can as well be positively as negatively electrical, so acid and base are not bound as properties to this or that actuality. Each thing is only relatively acid or base. What seems to be a decided base or acid gets in the so-called sinosomatics. Alright, let's look it up. I've said it enough times. Whoa. Whoa. Sinosomatics. Wow, okay, this looks like it's something that is only somatic symptom. When a person has significant focus on physical symptoms. Somatic. Okay, so somatic means... Man, I don't know. Somatic means like, oh, you're just thinking of it. And it's hurting. Like psychosomatic. So, sinosomatic. Synthesis? Synthesis of thought, maybe? The opposite significance in relation to something else. In this way, the result of the experiment sublates the moments or energies as properties of determinate things, and frees the predicates from their subjects. These predicates, as they are in truth, are found only as universals. Because of this independence, they therefore get the name of matters, which are neither bodies nor properties, and certainly we are on our guard against calling oxygen, etc., positive and negative electricity, heat, etc., bodies. The matter, by contrast, is not a thing that is, but being as universal, or in the mode of the concept. Reason, which is still instinct, makes this correct distinction. Without without being conscious that just by testing the law in all sensory being, it thereby sublates the merely sensory being of the law, and that when it conceives the moments of the law as matters, their essentiality has become for the law a universal, and in this expression is marked as an unsensory sensory, as the incorporeal and yet objective being. We now have to see what turn its results take for the reason instinct, and what new shape of observing emerges therewith. We see as the truth of this experimenting consciousness the pure law which liberates itself from sensory being. We see it as concept which, while present in sensory being, moves in independently and unrestrained, and while immersed in it is free of it in simple concept. This, which is in truth the result and essence, now emerges for this consciousness itself, but as the object, and indeed, since for it the object is precisely not a result, and is without relation to the preceding movement as a particular kind of object, and the relationship of consciousness is to it as another kind of observing. Such an object, which has the process in it the simplicity of the concept, is the organic. It is this absolute fluidity in which the determinacy through which it would be only for another is dissolved. If the inorganic thing has the determinacy for its essence, and that reason constitutes the completeness of the movement's concept only together with another thing, and therefore gets lost when it enters into the movement, then in the organic essence, by contrast, all determinancies through which it is open to another are subjugated under the organic simple unity. None of them emerge as essential. None of them emerges as essential, as free to enter into relation with another, and consequently the organic maintains in itself its relation. Thank you all for stopping by today. I'm glad to have shared the part 7 of Hegel. We'll continue this on in the next video with part 8, exactly where we left off. Hope to see you soon. And make sure to tell your boss that they should pay you enough to live, because you deserve it.